The fence was repaired. Pauline Fletcher stood in her doorway at the first gray hint of dawn, her lantern trembling in her grip, her breath stolen clean from her chest. The broken rails she had gone to sleep mourning were standing straight and proud, the split timber replaced with fresh-cut planks that smelled of pine and honest effort. Someone had come in the dead of night, worked in silence and shadow, and slipped away before the sun had any say in the matter. Her heart was hammering not from fear, but from something far more terrifying than fear. Because she knew, with a certainty that sat in her stomach like a hot coal, exactly who had done this. She pressed her forehead against the door frame and closed her eyes. 3 days. That was how long she had known Jonas Conroy was camped somewhere in the hills above Ridgeline Creek, watching over this property the way a wounded man watches over a wound he cannot stop touching. She had told herself she did not care. She had told herself the past was a sealed room and she had thrown away the key. She had told herself that a man who carried that kind of darkness, who carried warrants in 3 territories and a reputation that made sheriffs ride the long way around, was not a man she had any business thinking about at midnight when the wind came through the gap under her door. She had told herself all of those things, and now here was his answer, driven into her earth in pine and iron nail, mending what she could not mend alone. She pressed her knuckles hard against her mouth. The night that brought them to this moment had started, as most ruinous nights did, with a letter. It had arrived 6 weeks ago on the eastbound stage from Amarillo, delivered by a boy who dropped it on her porch step and ran as if the envelope itself might bite. Pauline had been on her knees in the garden at the time, coaxing the last of her late-season carrots from ground that had gone hard and uncooperative in the dry heat of an October that refused to behave like October. Her hands had been caked with soil, her hair had been coming loose from its pins, and she had been perfectly, fiercely content with the small and manageable facts of her own life. She had read the letter standing right there in the dirt. By the time she reached the second paragraph, she had sat down in the garden without meaning to. The letter was from a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named Orville Prout, who represented the interests of Clement Hatch, the same Clement Hatch who owned the Ridgeline Creek Water Company and half the commercial property in the county. Hatch was calling in a debt. Not Pauline's debt precisely, but her late husband Daniel's debt, a promissory note signed 4 years ago when Daniel Fletcher had been 3 months from dying and desperate to keep the farm going for his wife and his pride. The debt had passed to Pauline upon Daniel's death, and now Clement Hatch, who had held it quietly like a man holding a card he intended to play at exactly the right moment, had decided to play it. She had 60 days to produce $480 or surrender the property. $480 was not money that existed in Pauline Fletcher's world. Her world was 30 acres of river-fed farmland in the hill country of the New Mexico Territory, a vegetable garden, a small dairy herd of 4 cows, a broken fence along the south border that her neighbor's hogs kept pushing through, and a grief that had learned after 2 years to keep itself quiet during daylight hours. She was 31 years old. She was not afraid of work. She was afraid of this. She had spent the first week after the letter calculating. She sold one of the cows, which was a kind of heartbreak all its own, and raised $87. She rode into the town of Ridgeline, which was the kind of small western town that had a church at one end, a saloon at the other, and a moral geography that suggested the two were in constant negotiation, and she spoke to every merchant and banker within walking distance of the main street. She received 3 expressions of deep sympathy and $0. It was Thomas Greaves, the barber, who told her about the new man camping in the hills. Thomas Greaves was not a gossip by nature, but he was a repository of information by necessity, because men talked in barber chairs the way they talked nowhere else, freely and without armor. He had heard, from the deputy who had heard it from the telegraph operator, that someone was asking quiet questions about the Clement Hatch situation. asking them in the kind of quiet voice that suggested the person doing the asking was accustomed to getting answers. Thomas had described the man as tall, dark-haired, and wearing a coat that had seen serious weather. He had described a face that was not precisely handsome, but that commanded attention the way a ridge of mountains commands attention, not because it is beautiful but because it is there and you cannot look away from it. He had described eyes the color of the creek water in deep summer, where it runs green over the limestone shelves. Pauline had set her cup down very carefully on Thomas's counter. "Did anyone get a name?" she had asked. Thomas had shrugged. "Conroy," he said. "That's what the deputy thought he heard, Jonas Conroy." The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had not heard that name in 7 years. She was 24 when she first met Jonas Conroy, and he was 26, and neither of them had been wise enough to recognize what they were stepping into. It had been in the spring of 1879, in the town of Cimarron, where Pauline had been living with her aunt following her parents' deaths in a wagon accident the previous autumn. Cimarron in those years was a turbulent place, the kind of town where land disputes and water rights and old cattle war grudges ran just underneath the surface of every conversation, and the violence that resulted was rarely surprising to anyone who lived there, and never, ever punished with sufficient consistency. Jonas had been working as a ranch hand on the Beecham, spread outside of town. He had come in on a Saturday afternoon with 2 other men she did not know, and had ordered a coffee at the counter of her aunt's dry goods store, which was also the only establishment in Cimarron that served coffee and was not also a saloon. He had been dusty and tired, and he had said thank you for the coffee in a voice that suggested he meant it, which was more than a great many men managed. She had noticed his hands first. They were the hands of a man who worked, broad and calloused and capable, but he held the coffee cup with a strange and deliberate gentleness, as if he was aware of his own strength and was constantly managing it. She found herself watching those hands and then feeling embarrassed about watching those hands. He had come back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the 3rd Saturday, they were talking. By the 5th, she had learned that he was from a small farm in central Texas, that his mother had died when he was 12, that he had come north following the cattle trails and stayed north because the sky was different up here, whiter somehow, and he had not yet figured out why that mattered to him, but he knew that it did. She had told him about the wagon accident, which was not something she told people readily, and he had listened in a way that men almost never listened, without trying to fix anything or offer a lesson. He had simply received what she said and held it with the same careful gentleness he brought to the coffee cup. By the 8th Saturday, she was in love with him, and she knew it, and it terrified her. The trouble had started in the fall of that year, the way trouble in that part of the world often started, over water. The Beecham Ranch had been in a long, simmering dispute with the neighboring Aldridge operation over water rights along the creek that ran through both properties. Jonas had been a Beecham man and loyal to his employer, but he had also been a man who watched what was happening around him with clear eyes, and what he saw was that Chester Beecham was not simply defending his water rights. He was trying to take the Aldridge operation apart entirely, and he was using men like Jonas to do it. When Chester Beecham ordered his foreman to run the Aldridge cattle off the disputed creek land, Jonas had refused the order. The foreman had said some things that could not be unsaid. Jonas had said some things in return. A fist had been thrown, and then another, and by the end of it Jonas Conroy was no longer a Beecham man and had nowhere to sleep that night except under the stars. He had come to the dry goods store. Pauline had opened the back door without thinking about it, which was the kind of thing you do when your heart has already made a decision that your mind has not caught up with yet. He had stayed 3 days in the storage room above the store, sleeping on sacking, eating the bread and beans she brought up to him. They had talked through the nights in low voices, sitting on opposite sides of the narrow room with a lamp between them. She had told him about her parents and about the plans she had made for herself before the accident that unmade all plans. He had told her about the farm in Texas, about his father's death 2 years after his mother's, about the way he had been free and lost at the exact same moment. He had told her about what he believed, about fairness, and about taking responsibility for the things you could control, about how a man ought to measure himself not by what he owned, but by what he refused to do. On the second night he had reached across the lamp and taken her hand, and she had let him, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. On the third morning, Chester Beecham had ridden into Cimarron with 4 men and a county deputy, and a warrant that accused Jonas Conroy of cattle theft, a charge that was fabricated, and that everyone in the room that day understood to be fabricated, but that was also entirely legal and entirely sufficient. Jonas had looked at her through the back window of the storeroom, had understood what was about to happen, and had made a decision. He had gone out the front door. He had not run. But the deputy had not been a careful man, and the Beecham riders had been carrying a violence that was looking for an excuse, and what should have been a simple arrest had turned messy and loud and ultimately bloody. One of the Beecham men had drawn his pistol, and Jonas, who was unarmed and who had genuinely intended to submit to the arrest, had taken a horse from the rail and ridden rather than be shot down in a street over a lie. That had made him a fugitive. He had managed to get a note to her a week later through a circuit preacher who traveled that road. The note said 3 things: that he was not a thief, that what had happened between them had been the most real thing in his life, that he was sorry. She had stood at the store counter and read it until the words blurred. She had married Daniel Fletcher 14 months later. Daniel was a steady, decent man who had loved her gently and well, who had worked the Ridgeline property with patience and hope, and who had died of a lung sickness 2 years ago at the age of 36, leaving her the farm and the grief and the 4 cows and the broken fence, and apparently $480 of debt she had known nothing about. She had not heard Jonas Conroy's name in 7 years until Thomas Greaves said it in the barber's chair. She had gone home that day and sat in her kitchen for a long time. She had told herself she was not going to seek him out. She was not going to go up into those hills and find that camp. She was not going to reopen a door that the years had mercifully sealed. She had built a life here, quiet and self-contained and honest, and she was not going to compromise it over a ghost from her past who was still carrying warrants and apparently still camping in the wilderness like a man who had never learned how to belong somewhere. She had told herself all of that. And then on the 5th day after Thomas's revelation she had saddled her bay mare, ridden up the creek road as far as the old cedar break at the foot of the hills, tied the horse and walked the rest of the way on foot. She found his camp in a hollow between 2 cedar ridges, tucked back from the sight line of the road, the way a man sets up camp when he has practice at not being found. There was a fire ring, cold but recent, a bedroll, a canvas sack. A horse picketed to a cedar, a good solid gray with quiet eyes. Jonas Conroy was sitting on a rock at the edge of the hollow, cleaning a Winchester rifle with the methodical patience of a man who trusts familiar tasks. He looked up when she came through the cedar break, and his face did something complicated that she watched happen before he could stop it. A quick violent pleasure followed immediately by a wariness that was 7 years old and bone deep. He was 33. The years had carved him. The face she remembered had been young in a way she had not fully recognized as young until she saw what it had become, harder and more deliberate, a face that had learned to give less away. But the eyes were the same. The creek water green of them, the particular quality of attention in them, the way they settled on her as if she was something worth taking seriously. She stopped 10 feet away. He said, "Pauline," just that. She said, "You need to tell me what you're doing here, Jonas." "Sitting," he said, with a very slight upturn of one corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was the ancestor of one. "Do not do that," she said. "Do not be easy about this." The almost smile fell away. He set the rifle aside and stood, and he was exactly as tall as she had remembered, which was taller than she found convenient at the moment. "I heard about the Hatch situation," he said. Word travels. Word does not travel to wherever you have been for 7 years, she said. Someone told you. Someone reached out. He was quiet for a moment. There are people in this territory who keep an eye out for me, he said. People who know I do not want any woman who was ever good to me to lose what she has worked to build. I got word. I came. The honesty of it hit her harder than she had anticipated. She had been prepared for evasion. She had been prepared for charm or for distance, and she had an arsenal ready for either. She had not been prepared for the plain, direct statement of a man who had thought about her for 7 years and was not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at the camp around her, at the sparse and functional economy of a life lived without permanence. There was not a single unnecessary thing. Just what he needed to survive and nothing more. What exactly do you think you can do about it? She said. Quite a bit, possibly, he said. If you will let me. You are a wanted man. In Texas and in the Indian Territory, he said. New Mexico Territory warrant was dropped 2 years ago when the actual thief confessed to the Cimarron charge. I have a copy of that paper if you would like to see it. She had not known that. The ground shifted slightly under her understanding of the situation. There are still warrants elsewhere, he said, and to his credit he said it without flinching. I am not pretending to be a man without a history. I am pretending to be exactly what I am, which is a man who knows certain things and can get certain things done, and who has specific reasons for wanting Clement Hatch to discover he is not as invulnerable as he believes. What reasons? She said. Beyond the ones that concern me. He looked at her for a long time. Hatch has been running a water rights scheme through 3 counties, he said. He buys up notes from desperate men, most of them widows and small farmers, and then he calls them due at the same time. Anyone who cannot pay loses their land, and the land reverts to a holding company that Hatch controls under a different name. He has done this 14 times in 5 years. Most of those 14 families are gone now, scattered, broken up, and you have been watching this. I have been gathering evidence of it, he said, with the intent of getting it to the United States Marshal's office in Santa Fe, evidence of a conspiracy to defraud, which is a federal matter and one that carries consequences Hatch would find uncomfortable. She stared at him. How long have you been gathering this evidence? 8 months, he said, and you came here now because of me. He did not look away. Because of you, he said simply. Yes. She turned and looked at the cedar trees and the thin strip of October sky above the hollow and the distant shine of the creek far below, and she breathed carefully for a while. The fence on my south border is broken, she said eventually. 3 rails. The Dawson hogs come through and they root up the garden. She did not know why she said it. It was not what she had meant to say. It was a small and irrelevant fact, but it was what came out. I noticed, he said quietly. She turned back to look at him. His face was as careful and open as she had known it to be once across a lamp in a small room above a dry goods store in Cimarron, and something in her chest that had been very still for a very long time moved. I'm not asking you for anything, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. I came up here to tell you that you do not need to do this on my account, that I can handle my own situation. I know you can, he said. You always could. Then why are you here? He looked at her with 7 years in his face and said, because I could not stay away, because I have tried and I am out of the ability to try any further. She left the camp. She rode home. She spent the evening doing exactly what she always did in the evenings, feeding the cows, cooking a simple supper, reading by the lamp until her eyes grew tired, and then she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the creek and the wind and the particular silence of a house that holds only one person. She had not given him permission to do anything. She had not encouraged him. She had been composed and clear, and she had ridden home, and that was the end of it. And yet she had told him about the fence. The night passed, then another, then 5 more. She went about her days with the focused economy of a woman who has learned to keep her own counsel. She worked her garden in the mornings before the heat set in, harvested the last of the season's produce, mended her winter clothing, corresponded with a seed merchant in Albuquerque about her spring order. She did not go back to the cedar brake. She did not send word. She did not do anything that could be described as an invitation. But on the 8th night after her visit to his camp, she had gone to sleep and woken at 3 in the morning to the sound of something in the yard, a rhythmic sound, patient and deliberate, and she had lain in the dark and understood what it was, and she had not gotten up, and she had not called out, and eventually she had gone back to sleep. And the fence was repaired. She stood in the doorway at dawn with the trembling lantern and looked at the new rails and the fresh-cut planks and the clean, careful nailwork, and she thought about what it cost a man with a price on him in 2 territories to stand in a woman's yard in the dark and do something that kind, that quietly, that without expectation. She thought about what it said about him. She thought about what it said about her, that she had told him about the fence. She went inside and put the kettle on. Jonas Conroy did not come down from the hills that day, nor the day after. He was giving her time, she understood, which was a more sophisticated thing than many men managed. He had acted. He had offered something. Now he was waiting to see what she did with it. What she did was go about her days. What she also did was begin to think very carefully about Clement Hatch. The situation was this. She had 42 days remaining of her 60-day window before Hatch would move to foreclose. She had $87 from the cow sale. She needed $393 more, which was an impossible number for a lone woman with a small farm and a recent bad harvest. And somewhere in the hills above her property, a man with a complicated past and a collection of federal evidence was camped in the cedars and waiting. She was not a woman who waited for rescue. She had never been that woman, and she did not intend to become her now. But she was also not a woman foolish enough to refuse a genuine ally simply because accepting his help required her to revise the story she had been telling herself for 7 years. The story was this. She had loved Jonas Conroy recklessly and too young, and then life had intervened and separated them. And she had built a good life with a good man, and she was not going to burn what remained of that good life on the coals of something that was over. The revision was this. Daniel was gone. What she owed his memory was honesty and grief and gratitude, which she had given in full measure. What she did not owe him, or anyone, was the permanent refusal of everything that came after. She saddled the bay mare on the 10th morning after fixing the fence. Jonas heard her coming before she cleared the cedar break. He was at the fire with a coffee pot, and he had a second tin cup out before she had her horse tied, which told her more about what he had been thinking about than anything he could have said. She sat on the opposite rock from his and accepted the cup and drank and looked at him. "Tell me about your evidence," she said. He told her. It was more than she had expected and organized with a precision that surprised her. He had 13 affidavits from families who had lost property to Hatch's scheme, collected over 8 months of quiet travel through the territory. He had copies of the promissory notes and the corresponding transfer documents showing the land going into the holding company. He had a sworn statement from a clerk in Hatch's Santa Fe office who had become uneasy with his employer's methods. He had, and this was the part that made her set her cup down, a letter in Clement Hatch's own hand describing the scheme in terms that left nothing ambiguous, written to a business partner in Tucson who had apparently disagreed with Hatch's methods and kept the letter as insurance. "How did you get the letter?" she said. "The business partner in Tucson came to feel that Hatch was a liability," Jonas said. "He was persuaded to hand it over." "Persuaded how?" "I can be convincing," Jonas said. She looked at him. "I need to know whether anyone was hurt." His eyes met hers steadily. "No one was hurt," he said. "He handed it over voluntarily. The man in Tucson wanted Hatch stopped as much as I do for his own reasons." She believed him. She had always been good at reading Jonas Conroy, perhaps because he had never given her a reason not to trust her own reading of him. "If you take this to the marshal's office," she said, "what happens to you?" The pause before his answer was the most honest thing he had said yet. "I do not know precisely," he said. "The New Mexico warrant is clear. The Texas warrant is for something I did not do, but it is still a warrant and I cannot be certain how a federal marshal will read a complicated situation. So you might go to prison. It is possible, he said. I think more likely I would be held while the Texas situation was sorted out. A few months, perhaps. And you have been carrying this evidence for 8 months rather than turning it over because I wanted to make certain it was complete enough that it could not be argued away, he said. And because I was tracking down the last pieces of it. He stopped. And because once I turn it over, I lose any ability to control what happens. The thing takes on its own momentum. I wanted it to be right before I released it. You are a careful man, she said. I try to be, he said. I have not always succeeded. The wind moved through the cedar tops above them. Below, the creek caught the morning light in pieces. Somewhere in the distance, one of her remaining cows produced a long, mournful complaint that made her lips twitch. I want to go with you to Santa Fe, she said, to the marshal's office. He looked at her. That is not without risk for you. Jonas, she said, and the sound of his name in her own voice, used directly, deliberately, surprised her a little. I have been managing risk on my own for 2 years. I think I can manage the risk of accompanying a man to a government office. Something in his face shifted. The careful distance he maintained, that deliberate management of his own expression, had a crack in it, and through the crack she saw something she recognized from a lamplit room 7 years ago, the plain, uncomplicated fact of a man who cared about her beyond his ability to conceal it. All right, he said. They planned it with care. He could not ride into Ridgeline itself, because while the New Mexico warrant was resolved, there were men in the county who knew his face from earlier, less resolved times, and a complication now would undo everything. He would ride a different route, north through the Mesa country, and meet her at the crossroads above the Rios Flats, 2 hours' ride from Ridgeline. From there, they would travel together to Santa Fe, which was a day and a half of riding. She went home and packed what she needed. She arranged for her neighbor, a reliable woman named Edna Garber whose husband farmed the next quarter section, to look in on the cows. She left before first light, rode the long way to the crossroads, and found Jonas already there when she arrived, the gray horse patient beside him in the cold morning air. He looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since she came back into his orbit, as if she was something he could not entirely believe was real, as if he was conscious at every moment of the impermanence of her presence and was trying to memorize what he had before it was gone. She understood the feeling precisely, because she had it too. They rode north as the sky lightened, skirting the Mesa country, keeping to the dry washes where possible. Jonas knew this country with the thoroughness of a man who had had reason to learn it carefully, and he chose their route with an instinct that made her feel, despite everything, entirely safe. That was perhaps the strangest thing, she thought, that in the company of a man with warrants in 2 territories, riding toward a confrontation with a federal office that might result in his own arrest, she felt entirely safe. They did not talk a great deal during the first hour of riding. The silence was not uncomfortable. It had always been this way between them. She remembered now, the ease of quiet, the sense that they did not need to fill space but could simply inhabit it together. "Why did you fix the fence?" she said, when they stopped to water the horses at a spring below the mesa. He looked up from where he was crouching at the water's edge. "The garden needed protecting," he said. "That is the practical answer." "Yes," he said. She waited. He stood and looked at the horizon for a moment, that particular habit of his, taking a moment with the distance before bringing his attention back to what was close. "Because I could not give you back the time," he said. "The years that were not what they should have been. I could not fix that, but I could fix the fence." She breathed very carefully for a moment. "It was a small thing," he said. "I knew that, but it was the thing I could do." She looked at him, this man who had camped in the hills above her property, and worked in the dark with his hands, and slipped away before dawn out of a precise and careful respect for the complexity of her situation. And she thought about all the large and dramatic gestures that men made in the name of love, the speeches and the declarations and the grand performances. and she thought that she had never in her life been as moved by anything as she was by the image of Jonas Conroy kneeling in her yard in the dark and working with genuine care on 3 fence rails that she could not reach on her own. It was not a small thing, she said. He looked at her. She did not look away. Pauline, he said, and the word had a weight in it that she felt in her chest. Let us get to Santa Fe, she said. There is time for the rest after. His face did the complicated thing again, that involuntary movement of feeling, and then he got back on the gray horse and she got back on the bay mare and they rode north. They made camp that night in a shallow canyon below the Santa Fe Range, where a stand of cottonwood trees along a dry creek bed provided shelter from the wind that had picked up in the afternoon and was carrying a real bite of November cold. Jonas built the fire with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything, and she unpacked the provisions from her saddle bag, and they ate side by side in the firelight in a silence that was something more than comfortable now, that had a warmth in it that had nothing to do with the fire. He told her about the 8 months. She had not asked for the whole story, but it came out in the way that things come out between 2 people who are finally, after a long waiting, in the same place at the same time with nowhere else to be. He had been in Colorado when the word came to him about the Hatch situation. He had known about Hatch's operation for 2 years already, had been building his evidence for another 3 months, had been thinking about what to do with it and how to bring it down in a way that would stick, that would not be wriggled out of by clever lawyers and political connections. The word about Pauline's situation had added a specificity to his purpose that had cut through all remaining hesitation. You could have simply sent the evidence anonymously, she said. You did not need to come yourself. I know, he said, but you came. I came, he said. I stopped lying to myself about why about halfway through Colorado. She smiled at the fire. What lie had you been telling? That I was coming purely on principle, he said, as a matter of justice for the families involved, which was true but was not the whole truth. And the whole truth, he turned and looked at her directly, and in the firelight his face was all the things it was, the weathered hardness and the careful intelligence and the precise gentleness that had always been the thing that made her trust him. The whole truth is that you are the whole truth, he said. You have been the whole truth for 7 years. I have simply been a long time getting back to say so. The fire cracked. A cottonwood branch shifted in the wind. Somewhere above the canyon wall, a night bird sent its cry out into the dark. She reached across the distance between them and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers, and they sat like that for a long time, neither of them moving, neither of them speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said that their hands were not already saying. Santa Fe in November of 1886 was a town in the middle of its own complicated becoming, that particular point in the territory's development when the railroad had arrived and changed everything about commerce and speed and possibility, when the old ways and the new were still in visible negotiation with each other, when the United States Marshal's office operated out of a solid adobe building on the plaza and took its authority seriously. They arrived on the second morning. Pauline tied the horses at the rail outside the marshal's office while Jonas checked the evidence package he carried in the inner pocket of his coat, a flat leather folder that contained everything he had spent 8 months gathering. I go in with you, she said. You do not need to, he said. If this goes badly, there is no reason for you to be involved. Jonas, she said. If you walk in there and they hold you, who is going to explain to the marshal what the evidence is and why it matters and what needs to happen with it. You need someone on the outside who knows the full picture. He looked at her for a moment. You are the most practical woman I have ever known, he said. Yes, she said. Now let us go. The marshal on duty was a compact, gray-mustached man named Elias Thorne, who had the deliberate, unhurried manner of a man who had learned that patience was the most useful quality in his line of work. He received them at his desk with an expression that did not change significantly when Jonas introduced himself and placed the leather folder on the desk. I am aware of Jonas Conroy, Marshal Thorne said. Specifically, I am aware of a Texas warrant and an Indian Territory warrant. The Indian Territory situation is a misidentification, Jonas said, without heat. The man who was seen was not me. I have a witness statement to that effect in the folder. The Texas situation is more complicated, and I am prepared to discuss it at whatever length is required, after you have looked at what else is in the folder. Thorne looked at him for a moment, then looked at Pauline, then looked at the folder. He picked it up and opened it. The next hour and a half was the most carefully managed conversation Pauline had ever witnessed. Jonas presented each piece of evidence with a precision that she had not fully expected, explaining its provenance, its significance, how it connected to the other pieces, building the architecture of the case against Clement Hatch with a methodical clarity that would have done credit to a lawyer. Thorne asked questions, sharp and specific, and Jonas answered each one directly and without embellishment. She spoke 3 times, once to confirm the details of her own situation with the promissory note, once to provide the context of the 13 other families, and once, at a moment when Thorne seemed uncertain about the reliability of a particular affidavit, to point out that the 3 corroborating documents on the following pages removed any reasonable doubt about it. Thorne looked at her when she said that. "You have read all of this," he said. "We went through it together last night," she said, "by the fire." Thorne looked back at Jonas, then he closed the folder. Then he was quiet for a moment, which Pauline found more agonizing than any amount of words would have been. "This is a serious package," Thorne said. "If what is in here is what it appears to be, Clement Hatch is looking at federal fraud charges with enough evidence to make a very uncomfortable trial. I'm going to need to hold this and consult with my office in Albuquerque before I can tell you what we can do." "How long?" Jonas said. "Give me 2 weeks," Thorne said. "Come back in 2 weeks." He looked at Jonas over his desk. "In the meantime, Mr. Conroy, I am going to be direct with you. The Texas warrant, tell me what happened," Jonas told him. Full account, clear and honest, including the parts that reflected badly on his choices without softening them. The horse he had taken to escape the crowd outside the Cimarron store. The subsequent charge of horse theft that had been filed after the cattle theft charge failed to stick. The horse had belonged to Chester Beecham's foreman. He had abandoned it in the next county and it had been returned to its owner. He had never denied the horse, only argued the context. Thorne listened. He did not interrupt. "I can talk to Texas," Thorne said finally. "This may take time, it may not go the way you hope. But I am willing to try, given the service you are providing with this evidence and given the details you have described. I cannot make promises." "I am not asking for promises," Jonas said. "I am asking for a fair hearing." Thorne nodded. "That you will have," he said. They walked out of the marshal's office into the November air of the Santa Fe Plaza, and Pauline exhaled a breath she felt as though she had been holding since the moment she walked in. Jonas stood beside her and looked at the plaza without speaking. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "That could have been worse," she said. "Considerably," he said. "He is going to look into it seriously, you could tell." "Yes," Jonas said. "Thorne has that reputation. A man who does not accept interference from men like Hatch." He paused. "We have 2 weeks." She looked at him. He was looking at the plaza, and there was something in his face that was both relief and anxiety in equal measure, the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down and is not entirely certain what to do with his hands now that they are empty. "Come back with me," she said. He turned and looked at her. "To the property," she said. "There is a storage room above the storage room, which is to say there is a proper spare room with a proper bed, and I am not sending you back to a camp in the Cedar Hills when I have a spare room." She paused. "And the fence will need checking. You did the south border, but the east border has been a concern for some time." He watched her for a moment, this man with 7 years of distance between them and a face full of something that he was still learning to let show. "You said come back with me," he said. "I said it," she said. "I meant it. Pauline," his voice was low. "I need you to be certain. I am not a simple situation. I may still be heading toward a legal complication in Texas. I'm a man who has lived rough for years, and I do not know yet what shape my life is going to take once this is resolved. I am not offering you something easy. Jonas Conroy, she said, and she stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the November light, green as the creek in the deep of summer, green as a possibility she had almost given up on. I have had easy. Easy was good, and I am grateful for it. I am 31 years old, and I am not afraid of complicated. I am afraid of spending another 7 years in a house alone, wondering what I was too careful to allow. He raised his hand and touched her face with the back of his fingers, with that deliberate gentleness she had noticed the first time she saw his hands around a coffee cup, the consciousness of his own strength in the care he took. Her breath came and went in a rush. "All right," he said. "All right." He kissed her in the Santa Fe Plaza, with the November wind coming down from the Sangre de Cristos and the horses at the rail behind them and the afternoon light going gold across the adobe walls. And it was the single most accurate thing she had felt in 7 years, the precise rightness of it, the sense of something that had been in the wrong place arriving, finally, in the place where it belonged. They rode home. 2 days of riding, but different days than the ride north had been. They talked. They talk the way people talk when they have been silent for too long, and the silence is finally broken, and the words come not in a rush but in a steady, continuous stream, because there is so much ground to cover, and the distance seems manageable now that they are covering it together. She told him about Daniel, the full, honest account of it, the good marriage and the real love and the grief, and the way the grief had changed shape over the 2 years since. She did not minimize it, and he did not expect her to. He listened with the full attention she had always found remarkable in him, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like a man who loved you well," and she said, "He did." And that was the whole of the epitaph, and it was sufficient, and it was true. He told her about the years in between, about Colorado and Kansas, and the Panhandle and the Indian Territory, about the kinds of work available to a man without a settled address and a warrant following him. Range work mostly, occasional work for a pair of lawyers in Denver who used him to locate witnesses in difficult cases, and who did not ask too many questions about his situation. And once, a winter spent in a line camp in the Wyoming Territory so remote that he saw no other human being for 63 days. And he said that was the winter he understood that the life he was living was not a life at all but a postponement, and that he needed to decide what it was he was postponing it toward. "And you decided," she said. "I decided that I had already known for years what I was postponing it toward," he said. "I had simply been telling myself that it was not possible." "What changed?" He thought about it. "Nothing changed," he said. "I just got tired of the lie." She reached across the space between their horses, a small, ungainly stretch, and he took her hand and held it for a moment before the horse's movement made it impractical. Back at the property, the situation was exactly as she had left it. The 3 remaining cows regarded her return with the philosophical placidity of creatures who have decided that opinions are more effort than they are worth. And Edna Garber had done a thorough job of looking after things. The house was cold from days without a fire, but it warmed quickly, and Pauline put the kettle on and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the quality of warmth that came not from a stove but from the simple animal fact of another person in the house. She showed Jonas the spare room, which was small but adequate, with a view of the garden from the window and a rope bed with a decent mattress, and a quilt she had pieced herself in the winter after Daniel died. He stood in the room and looked around it with an expression she could not immediately name, then turned to her. "I want you to know that I understand what this is and what it is not," he said. "I am under your roof because you offered it, and I am grateful for it, and I am not going to make it into something that you did not offer." She looked at him steadily. "You are an extraordinarily thoughtful man," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "I have not always managed it." "No," she said, "neither have I." She paused. The room is yours. The kitchen is available in the mornings. The east fence actually does need checking." She smiled. "Good night, Jonas." "Good night, Pauline," he said. The 2 weeks before they returned to Santa Fe were unlike any 2 weeks she could previously have described. Jonas was, as she had always known he would be, a man who worked. He rose early, before she did, and she would come into the kitchen to find the fire already laid and coffee already made, and he would be visible through the kitchen window in the yard, doing something that needed doing, something she had added to a mental list of tasks that the farm required, and that she had been working through alone for 2 years at whatever pace one woman could manage. He restrung the east fence. He repaired the hinge on the barn door that had been sticking since spring. He fixed the pump handle on the well. He replaced 3 rotted boards on the porch. He did these things without announcement and without waiting to be asked, which was both practical and also, she found, unexpectedly affecting. They had their meals together. They talked in the evenings by the fire. They learned each other again, not as the young people they had been in Cimarron, but as the people the years had made them, and she found that she liked the people the years had made. She liked the person the years had made of herself, which was perhaps not something she had fully acknowledged before. And she liked, without reservation, the person the years had made of Jonas, the directness of him, the patience, the way he could be completely still when stillness was needed and move with decisive efficiency when something required doing. On the 6th day, she found herself watching him from the kitchen window as he worked on the barn door, and the watching was not a casual thing. It was the specific and deliberate attention of a woman who has decided to stop pretending. She does not feel what she feels. And when he came inside for lunch and caught her looking at him with that attention, the air in the kitchen did something that required them both to breathe carefully for a moment. "Pauline," he said. "Do not say something careful and sensible," she said, a beat. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "I had something careful and sensible prepared," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been watching you be careful and sensible for 6 days, and I find I am entirely finished with it." He set down what he was carrying and crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her face in his hands, those broad and careful hands, and looked at her for a moment that felt longer than 6 days and longer than 7 years and longer than the whole accumulated distance between them. And then he kissed her with a completeness that made the Santa Fe Plaza kiss feel like a rehearsal. She laughed against his mouth after a moment, which surprised them both. "What?" he said. "7 years," she said. "That is a long time for a practical woman to be impractical about something." "You were not impractical," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "You were exactly right about what your life required of you. I was just always somewhere in the background being impractical on your behalf." "Very quietly," she said. "Very quietly," he agreed. "I am a quiet man." "You fixed my fence in the dark," she said. "I did," he said. "That is the most you have ever said to me with the fewest words," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her, and his face was open in a way that cost him something, that he was choosing to let her see because some choices, once made, need to be committed to entirely. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for 7 years across 4 territories, and I am through saying it quietly." "Good," she said, "because I love you and I intend to be very direct about it from now on." They rode to Santa Fe 2 weeks after the first meeting, on the 14th day exactly, as Thorne had asked. The marshal met them in the same office with a slightly different posture, the posture of a man who has done significant work and has results to report. The evidence against Clement Hatch was sufficient. The United States Marshal's office in Albuquerque had reviewed the package and agreed that federal fraud charges were warranted. Hatch had been served notice the day before, and his lawyers were already in motion, but Thorne was unimpressed by Hatch's lawyers and said so with a brevity that was almost admiring. The 14 promissory notes, including Pauline's, had been frozen pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. No foreclosure could proceed. The families had legal standing. Pauline closed her eyes for a moment and opened them again. "And the other matter," Jonas said. Thorne looked at him. The Texas situation is being reviewed. I have communicated with the Ranger District and they are willing to take a second look at the original charge in light of the Cimarron resolution and the service provided here. It will take time. You will need to be patient." He paused. "The Indian Territory warrant has been cleared. That took me 3 days and a telegram, but the misidentification is now confirmed and recorded." Jonas absorbed this with a stillness that told Pauline what it cost him. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me," Thorne said. "You did 8 months of work that my office would have taken years to accomplish, and you handed it over clean. That counts for something." He looked at Pauline. "Mrs. Fletcher, your debt cannot be called until the Hatch proceedings are resolved, which will take months at minimum and may result in the debt being voided entirely if it is found to be part of the fraudulent scheme. You are safe to stay on your property," she said. "Thank you," and it was a small word for what she felt. They walked out of the marshal's office for the second time, and this time the exhale was not careful and controlled. This time she laughed, a short, genuine, astonished laugh, and Jonas put his arm around her and pulled her into his side, and she went, because there was nowhere she would rather be. "Still a Texas warrant," he said. "A Texas warrant that is being reviewed," she said. "It may resolve well or it may not." "Then we will handle whatever it is when we know what it is," she said. "That is what people do, Jonas. They handle things as they come." He looked down at her. The Santa Fe Plaza was busy around them, the sounds of a working town in November, wagons and voices, and the distant percussion of a blacksmith somewhere nearby. "You are not bothered by the uncertainty," he said. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. "I am a farmer in the New Mexico Territory," she said. "Uncertainty is the fundamental condition of my existence. The weather, the prices, the creek level, the quality of the seed. I have been managing uncertainty for years." She looked up at him. "What I cannot manage is certainty about the wrong thing, certainty that I have to go through everything alone. That kind of certainty I find I have no patience for." He kissed her on the top of the head in the middle of the Santa Fe Plaza, which was not precisely the done thing, and which she did not mind in the least. They rode home that evening. The winter that followed was the kind of winter that teaches you what you are made of, severe and beautiful in the way that the New Mexico Territory manages with an indifference to human preference. The creek froze in January for the first time in 4 years. The snow came thick and stayed. The cows required constant attention, and the garden lay under a white silence that was both resting and waiting. Jonas was there. He was fully, practically, completely there, not as a temporary visitor or a man between circumstances, but as a man who had chosen where he was standing and intended to stand there. He helped with the cows. He kept the wood supply constant. He shoveled paths through the snow with a patience that never seemed to flag. He rode into Ridgeline for supplies when the road was passable, and came back with things she had mentioned in passing, in the way of a man who has been listening. Word moved through Ridgeline in the way that word always moved through small western towns, thoroughly and with embellishment. People knew that Pauline Fletcher had a man on her property. People knew, or thought they knew, things about Jonas Conroy, the more alarming version of the facts, filtered through 6 rounds of retelling. There were people who were concerned on Pauline's behalf, including Edna Garber, who came to call in December with a pie and a very direct expression. Pauline poured tea and let Edna say what she had come to say, which was that people were talking, and that a woman in Pauline's position needed to be careful about her reputation, and was she quite sure about this man? "I am quite sure about this man," Pauline said. "He has warrants," Edna said. "One remaining warrant that is under review," Pauline said, "which was filed on a charge that was false in retaliation for a labor dispute by a man who is no longer alive to press it." She paused. "He fixed my fence. He fixed my pump. He helped me stop a man who was going to take my farm from me along with 13 other farms. And he loves me, Edna, in the specific way that makes everything that came before it feel like the preliminary business." Edna looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at the pie. Then she said, Well, I suppose I should like to meet him properly. Jonas came in from the barn at that point with the snow still on his coat, and Edna Garber gave him the very thorough assessment that Edna gave everything, and Jonas endured it with a composed patience. And by the time the pie was half eaten, Edna had decided that she approved, which she communicated not by saying so but by refilling his teacup without being asked, which was, in Edna's system, the highest possible endorsement. A letter arrived from the Texas Ranger District in February, carried by the stage through 3 days of intermittent snow. Pauline brought it in from the mailbox and stood at the kitchen table holding it, because Jonas was in the barn and the letter had his name on it, and she was not going to open it, but she was not immediately able to set it down. He came in a quarter-hour later and saw her face and the letter in her hand, and understood in one look what the situation was. He crossed the kitchen and took the letter from her and opened it and read it, and she watched his face while he read. This face she had learned again this winter with the thoroughness of a woman who intends to keep what she has found. He looked up from the letter. His expression was not what she had feared. "Resolved," he said. She breathed. "The man who filed the original charge died 2 years ago," he said. "His son, who inherited the ranch, has declined to pursue the matter and has formally dropped the complaint. The warrant is vacated." He set the letter down on the table. "I am," he said, with the careful wonder of a man saying something he has not been able to say for a long time, "no longer a wanted man." She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put her arms around him, and he put his around her, and they stood like that for a long time in the kitchen with the winter outside the window and the stove ticking steadily in the silence. "You are free," she said against his shoulder. "Yes," he said, "I am free." He proposed to her in March. On the first day that felt like spring might actually be a real thing that was going to happen. Standing in the garden she was preparing for the new season, the soil dark and soft and full of promise. He did it with a simplicity that was entirely characteristic of him, without ceremony or grandeur, on one knee in the mud beside the south fence he had repaired in the dark 6 months ago, with a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone the color of the territorial sky. He asked her. She said yes. The ring went on her finger and fit as if it had been measured, which it had, because Jonas Conroy was a man who paid attention to detail and always had been. She kissed him in the garden in the spring mud with the new fence solid behind them and the creek running clear and high with snowmelt below, and it was the most anchored she had felt, she thought, in her entire life. Anchored to the earth and to the moment and to this person, this complicated, gentle, careful, extraordinary person who had come back to her out of the dark and fixed what was broken and stayed. They were married in May of 1887, in the church at the ridgeline end of town, the end with the moral aspirations. Thomas Greaves attended, pleased with himself about the role he had inadvertently played in bringing them together by mentioning the name in the barber's chair. Edna Garber stood with Pauline. Marshall Thorne had sent a brief, formal congratulatory note that managed, in the way of government correspondence, to be both official and warm. The Clement Hatch situation resolved, as these things do, slowly and in the courts, but it resolved. The federal fraud charges had teeth, and the evidence was clean, and Hatch's lawyers, despite their considerable resources, could not argue away 13 affidavits and a letter in Hatch's own handwriting. The proceedings took the better part of a year, but by the following spring, Hatch was facing prison, and the holding company through which he had absorbed the 14 properties was being unwound by court order. The promissory note on Pauline's property was voided. 7 of the 14 families were able to recover their land or receive compensation. It was not perfect justice, because perfect justice is a thing that human courts approximate rather than achieve, but it was enough. It was more than most of those families had any reason to expect. On the morning after the court's final ruling was telegraphed to Ridgeline, Jonas sat at the kitchen table and read the telegraph message twice, and set it down and looked out the window at the property that was now, with no legal ambiguity whatsoever, theirs. "We should plant more along the creek," he said. "The soil down there is rich enough for corn, and the fencing situation would support a few more head of cattle if we expanded the south pasture." She looked at him across the table. "You have been thinking about this for a while," she said. "All winter," he said. "I did not want to say anything until the legal matter was settled." She smiled. "Tell me what you have been thinking." He told her. He had thought about it carefully and with the characteristic thoroughness he brought to everything he decided to commit to. The corn along the creek. 3 more cows, which would give them a small but viable dairy operation. Expanding the garden. Eventually, perhaps, an orchard, apple and pear, which took years to establish but yielded abundantly once they did. He had sketched plans on paper, which he produced from his coat pocket with a slight embarrassment that she found entirely endearing. She looked at the plans. They were good. They were practical and thoughtful and showed a clear understanding of both the land and the market. "You are a farmer," she said. "You have always been a farmer." "I grew up on one," he said. "No," she said. "It is not the same thing. You understand the land. You think the way the land requires you to think in seasons, in the long view, in the patience of things that grow slowly." She looked up from the plans. "You are a farmer, Jonas, and this is your farm." He took a breath and let it out slowly. "This is our farm," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is precisely what I mean." She was pregnant by summer. She told him on a July evening when the heat had settled into the hills, and the creek was low, and the air smelled of cedar and dry grass, and the very specific stillness of a New Mexico July twilight. She told him standing in the garden, because the garden was where the most important things between them seemed to happen. He was very still for a moment in the way that he went still when something struck him deeply. Then he looked at her with an expression that she would keep, she thought, for the rest of her life, stored carefully among the things that mattered most, the look of a man for whom the world has just become something bigger and more astonishing than it was a moment ago. "A baby," he said. "In late January, I think," she said, "given the timing." He took her hands in both of his and held them the way he held everything that mattered, with deliberate and complete care. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "Very well," she said. "Better than well, actually. We will need to see the doctor in Ridgeline," he said, "and the spare room, it will need to be fitted out properly." "Jonas," she said, "and we should think about getting an extra wood before winter, more than usual, because you should not be hauling wood in January with a newborn, and I want to be sure we are set before then." "Jonas," she said again. He stopped and looked at her. "Stop thinking about logistics for a moment," she said, smiling. He smiled, that full smile that she had been collecting all year, each one of them a revelation because they came with a completeness that his younger self had not yet mastered. "Yes," he said. "Right." He brought her hands up and kissed them. "I am going to be a father." "You are," she said. "That is the most extraordinary thing I can imagine," he said simply. The baby arrived in late January of 1888, a boy, which surprised neither of them and delighted both. He came into the world in the bedroom of the farmhouse during a sleet storm, delivered by the doctor from Ridgeline, who arrived just in time, and who said afterward that it was among the more straightforward births he had attended, which was the highest compliment the practical sciences offered. Jonas was there for all of it, which was not the universal custom, but was never in question. He had held Pauline's hand for 4 hours and not once let go. They named him Daniel Jonas Fletcher Conroy. Daniel for the steady and decent man who had loved Pauline well, Jonas for his father, Fletcher Conroy because both names were theirs and the boy deserved both. When the doctor left, and the sleet was still coming down outside, and the lamps were lit in the bedroom, and the baby was sleeping with the absolute confidence of a person who has decided that this world is an acceptable arrangement, Pauline looked up at Jonas, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with his son sleeping in the crook of his arm. This big and careful man holding this small and complete person with the precise gentleness she had known about him from the very beginning. From a coffee cup on a Saturday afternoon, and she felt something that was beyond the words she had available for it. "He looks like you," she said. He looks like himself, Jonas said. He is not going to look like anyone but himself, I think. He has opinions already, you can see it, she laughed softly. About what? About everything, Jonas said. About the light and the temperature and the general arrangement of the world, he is evaluating it. He comes by that honestly, she said. Jonas looked at her. Does he? From both sides, she said. He leaned over carefully, the baby still sleeping undisturbed, and kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes. The farm grew into itself over the following years. The corn along the creek did well, better than Jonas had projected, because the soil down there was extraordinary and the water access reliable. The additional cows brought the dairy operation to a modest but genuine viability. The orchard was planted in the spring of 1889, apple trees chosen from a nursery catalog, with the care of a man investing in the long view, and they would take years to produce fruit, but they would produce it. And the rows of young trees along the north edge of the property became a thing Pauline came to associate with everything she believed about the future, patient and particular and full of what was coming. Little Daniel learned to walk in the summer of his first year, lurching across the kitchen floor with the heroic determination of the very young, and fell into his father's hands approximately 40 times before the skill was fully established. He was a serious child with a great deal to say, some of it in language and some of it in the concentrated physical investigation of everything within reach, and both his parents found him endlessly surprising. A second child came in the autumn of 1890, a girl this time, and they named her Margaret Ruth, which had been Pauline's mother's name, and which felt like the right and proper completion of something. Margaret was louder than Daniel had been and more immediately decisive about her preferences, and Jonas said that she had come out with positions already formed, and he was not going to argue with her. The letter from the Hatch case's final resolution arrived in December of 1890, 3 years after the original charges. Hatch had been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, reduced from a higher sentence by his age and his lawyers and the usual negotiations, but sentenced nonetheless. The holding company's assets had been divided, and 7 families had received compensation, and the other 7 had received nothing because the land had been resold and could not be recovered. And that injustice sat in Pauline's chest uncomfortably, as genuine injustice always does, because she knew that the 7 who lost were not less deserving than she was, and the outcome was not fair, and fairness is not the same as resolution, even when resolution is all that is available. She said this to Jonas one evening when the children were asleep and the fire was burning low, and he said, "No, it is not fair." He said it without softening it, and she appreciated that, the plain acknowledgement of it without the reflex to console it away. "We should write to the families," she said, "the ones who did not recover their land." "We can do that," he said. "I want to do more than write letters," she said. "I want to find out if any of them are still in the territory and what their circumstances are." He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that we have land," she said. "That there is the southwest quarter of this property that is not under cultivation and may not need to be under our cultivation specifically." She stopped. "I do not have a fully formed plan. I have the beginning of a direction." "Tell me the direction," he said. She told him. It was not fully formed, but it was genuine, and it had the shape of something that could become real with work. The southwest quarter, 40 acres of good creek-fed land, could be made available to one of the dispossessed families, leased at a rate that was not usurious, under terms that gave them real stability. It would not recover what Hatch had taken from all 7 of them, but it could be something for one. Jonas was quiet for a while, which was how he processed things that mattered. "The Roses," he said. "Do you remember reading about them in the affidavits?" She did. The Rosa family, the father and mother and 4 children, who had held their property for 12 years before Hatch's note took it, who had been growing corn and beans and keeping goats, who had been scattered by the loss with a specificity that the affidavit laid out in plain and heartbreaking detail. "I can find out where they are," Jonas said. "I know you can," she said. He found them in the spring. They were in Las Cruces. living in reduced circumstances in a way that the phrase reduced circumstances did not adequately describe. Jonas rode down to Las Cruces himself, because some conversations need to happen in person, and he came back 2 weeks later with a handshake agreement with Edmundo Rosa, the father, a compact and dignified man of 45 who had farmed his whole life, and who listened to the offer with the careful attention of a man who has learned to be cautious about things that sound like solutions. The Rosas moved onto the southwest quarter in the summer of 1891. It took a full season to bring the land into production, but the Rosas were farmers to the bone, and they knew what they were doing. And by the following year, the corn along the Southwest Creek line was as good as anything on the property. Pauline and Esperanza Rosa, who was Edmundo's wife and an astonishing cook, became friends of the kind that are made late in life, and that are therefore all the more valuable for being made with clear eyes, without the confusions of youth. Their children tumbled together with a democracy of childhood that made all philosophical statements about the territory's divisions seem somewhat beside the point. Time passed in the way that good time passes, with fullness and variation, and the steady accumulation of small moments that are not small at all. Daniel grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was an unusual combination and a useful one, and he spent a great deal of time following Jonas around the farm in the years when boys follow their fathers everywhere and want to understand everything. Margaret continued to have positions and continued to defend them with the confidence of a person who has never doubted her right to be heard, and Pauline found this quality in her daughter entirely delightful and not at all surprising. A third child came in 1893, another boy, James Edna Fletcher Conroy, the middle name being a slightly unconventional memorial to Edna Garber, who had died the previous spring of a sudden fever, and whose presence had been such a practical and loving part of their years in Ridgeline that the absence of her felt like a wrong shape in the air. Edna would have been pleased by the naming and also mildly flustered by it, which was precisely what she deserved. In the fall of 1893, Jonas rode up to the cedar brake above the property for the first time since the year everything began. He went alone in the late afternoon and tied the horse where he had once tied the gray and walked up through the cedar into the hollow. The camp was long gone, of course. The fire ring had been scattered by time and weather. The cedar trees had grown another 7 years into themselves. The hollow was quiet and full of the particular smell of cedar and autumn and the high country afternoon. He stood there for a while. Then he walked back down to the property and went in through the garden gate and found Pauline in the kitchen with the lamp already lit against the early dark, and James on her hip, and the smell of supper on the stove, and Daniel doing some kind of architectural project on the kitchen floor with pieces of wood he had collected from the barn. "The east fence has held beautifully," he said. She looked up. "Good," she said. She looked at him more carefully. "Where have you been?" "Up to the cedar brake," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How does it look?" "Like a long time ago," he said. She nodded. He crossed the kitchen and took James from her hip, settling the baby against his chest with the ease of a man 3 years into fatherhood, and James regarded this transfer with the placidity of a person who has decided his parents are reliable. Jonas stood beside Pauline at the stove, and she leaned her shoulder against his arm, and he looked at the kitchen around them, at the lamp and the supper and the child doing architecture on the floor and the baby against his chest, and the woman beside him who was every direction he had ever needed to be, and he was quiet for a moment with the full and uncomplicated reality of it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I used to think that the best I could do was not make things worse," he said. "That was the ceiling I put on myself. Do not make things worse. Be a man who does not leave damage behind him." He stopped. "I did not think I was entitled to more than that, to things that were genuinely good. I thought that was for other people." She was listening with her full attention, the way she listened when she understood that something real was being said. "I was wrong," he said simply. This is what I should have been aiming at all along. This is not more than I am entitled to. This is exactly what a life is supposed to be." She turned and looked at him. There were 7 years in her face and 6 years since, and the full accumulated knowledge of this man, and she loved all of it, the history and the present and what was coming, without reservation. "We are going to need more apple trees," she said. He blinked. Then he laughed, a full and genuine laugh that startled James and made Daniel look up from his architecture project and made the kitchen, already warm, warmer. "Yes," he said, "we are definitely going to need more apple trees." Daniel asked what apple trees had to do with anything, and Pauline explained that some conversations were between adults and that he should return to his architecture. And Daniel did, with the pragmatism of a child who has learned that some adult things are beyond productive inquiry. The orchard, when it finally bore fruit in 1895, 7 years after the first trees went in, was the finest thing on the property, which was itself among the finest properties along the Ridgeline Creek Valley. The apple harvest of that first full bearing year was more than they could use, more than they could sell at the Ridgeline market, and Jonas loaded 4 crates onto the wagon and drove them down to the Rosa property, and 4 more to a family further down the valley, who had come through hard times with a composure that deserved acknowledgment. Pauline stood at the fence and watched him drive out with the loaded wagon in the morning light, that tall man on the wagon seat with the reins easy in his hands and his hat brim catching the September sun. And she thought about a January night 6 years ago when he had stood in the same yard in the dark and worked by starlight and slipped away before dawn. She thought about what it said about a person, that act, the willingness to give care in the dark and ask nothing for it. The restraint of it, the consideration, the precise understanding that what the moment required was not the declaration of himself, but the simple, quiet fact of help. She had known from that morning, she thought. Looking at the repaired fence in the gray dawn light, she had known the shape of who he was more completely than she had known it even in the lamplit conversations of Cimarron, because who someone is when they think they are not being watched is the truest possible version. She had known. She had simply needed a little more time to arrive at the knowing. Daniel appeared at her elbow. He was 8 years old and had recently developed the habit of appearing silently beside people and making them jump, which he found more satisfying than was strictly polite. "Where is Papa going?" he said. "To the Rodriguez's," she said, "with apples." "Why?" "Because they could use them," she said. Daniel considered this. "We have a lot of apples," he said. "We do," she said. "That is exactly the point." He thought about it some more. "Is that why Papa planted so many trees, so we would have enough to give away?" She looked at her son, this serious boy with his father's patience and her own directness, and she thought, not for the first time, what it was to look at a child and see everything that brought them into being, every choice and chance and consequence and love. "Ask him when he gets home," she said. "He will tell you." He did ask. That evening at supper, with the lamp lit and James banging enthusiastically on the table with a spoon he had acquired by uncertain means and Margaret explaining to no one in particular why her opinion on the apple situation was the correct one, Daniel asked his father why they had planted so many apple trees. Jonas looked at him across the table. "Because the land is good," he said, "and good land should be generous." He looked at Pauline. "Someone taught me that." She met his eyes and shook her head slightly, smiling. "I am not sure I said it quite that way," she said. "You did not say it in words," he said, "but you said it." Outside, the September night was coming on slowly, the way the best nights do, with a deepening blue over the hills and the first stars appearing above the cedar ridge and the creek running steady and clear in the near dark below. The apple trees stood in their rows along the north edge of the property, heavy with the last of the season's fruit, roots deep in the earth, every branch that reached toward the sky a thing that had grown from what was planted with patience and with care. Inside, the lamp burned. The supper went on. The children were themselves, which was more than enough, and also, every day, more than could be anticipated. Jonas Conroy sat at the table of his own home, in the territory where he had found the life he had not known he was allowed to want, And the warrants were gone, and the fence was solid, and the orchard was bearing. And the woman across the table from him was looking at him with those eyes that had been looking at him since a Saturday afternoon in a dry goods store in Cimarron. And he was, with a completeness that left no room for the old doubts, entirely home. The gentle outlaw had repaired her garden fence in the dark, and slipped away before morning light ever arrived. And in doing so he had found, without intending to, without planning for it, in the precise and unhurried way that the best things arrive, his way back to her. And she, standing at the fence in the gray and trembling dawn, had recognized it for what it was, not a small thing, not a practical thing. A declaration written in pine and iron nail, in the language of a man who worked quietly and loved completely, and who had been, for 7 years across 4 territories, finding his way back to the only place that had ever felt like home. They stayed, they built, they grew. The orchard bore fruit every year, and every year Jonas loaded the wagon and took what was beyond their own use to the people along the valley who could benefit from it. And every year the rows of apple trees grew more established, more deeply rooted, more certain of themselves. And every spring, without fail, Pauline Fletcher Conroy could be found in the garden, on her knees in the dark earth with her hands in the soil and her heart in the present, coaxing things toward the light. Beside her, or not far from beside her, Jonas Conroy did the same. The fence held, the creek ran, the family grew, and the years that followed were long and full and good.